Now, before any arrests had actually taken place, sources would indicate that on the day before the shootout, one member of Local 107 was alleged to have warned DeGeorge that he had 24 hours to live. And a witness who'd talked to police had stated that DeGeorge himself had said, "I'm fingered. I've been told I've got 24 hours to live." Additional reports suggest that several men brought guns into Local 107 the night before, and that it was clear that top officials of 107 had made plans to whack DeGeorge.
The legends of America's mobs are woven into the fabric of society and pop culture. We've all seen the movies or heard the tales of these criminal organizations. Their stories of power, wealth, respect, family, greed, betrayal, violence, murder, and mayhem. While the golden age of the mobs may be over, organized crime continues to thrive, and the stories remain as infamous as ever. You're listening to the Gangland History Podcast, hosted by mob historian Jacob Stoops. He tells the true crime biographies of real-life mobsters and dives deep into the plots, subplots, and real facts behind organized crime in America. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Gangland History Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Stoops, mob historian, enthusiast, whatever you want to call me. Just don't call me late for dinner. We've got another great show today, and we're continuing the hits episode. My hope is to, in the next episodes, move on from the Philadelphia mob hits and get back to some biographies. I am waiting for some paperwork to come through. So for now, we've got 2 additional hits that we're going to discuss, and those are going to center around Teamsters Local 107 out of Philadelphia, which, as you'll see, battled the mob in the 1960s for control and eventually lost. And the mob would really control Teamsters Local 107 for many years afterwards as a result of some of the interactions that I'm about to highlight in this episode. I will say again, for the 3rd episode in a row, I'm not trying to glorify violence, murder, mayhem, but that is kind of what this show is about. And the mob, you can't cover the mob without covering some of that. I will say that this one was probably, of all the hits episodes that I have covered so far, probably the saddest. And it really throws a wrench in the idea that the Mafia doesn't hurt or kill people that aren't, in the street. This is really going to throw a wrench into that. Not only that, I think this is one of just many instances that shows that the mob has no qualms in killing women. That happened, and we're going to cover the case today. It's actually 3 people that were murdered, probably by elements of the Philadelphia mob. And remember, this started all the way back when I was doing the Angelo Bruno research. People, for whatever reason, seemed to think Bruno was a nonviolent boss. And in doing the research, well, yeah, he was certainly more docile than maybe the people that came afterwards, but he very clearly had no issues ordering murders. And as I've said, when you're a mob boss anywhere in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, ordering murders was standard operating procedure, and Angelo Bruno was no different. So before we get into the episode, I just want to take a small sliver of a second and say I'm approaching 10,000 subscribers. We're getting dangerously close. If we haven't already hit it by the time this video comes out, please help me get over that hump. There's something about kind of that 10,000 mark. Now, eventually I want to grow it to much more than that, but there is something about going from a 4-digit number to a 5-digit number and moving on to that 10,000 threshold. So if you're watching this video and you're not already subscribed, please subscribe, hit the bell, turn on notifications, share the show, do whatever you can. I implore you to kind of help me grow. This is my side hustle. I would love to eventually make it my main hustle, but for right now, this is my side hustle. This is a passion project for me. I love doing the research. I love shedding a light on old stories. I love kind of opening the window to the past. I love distilling myths. I love just doing the research. I think it's a lot of fun for me to do. And yeah, I thank everybody that has subscribed so far. And without further ado, let's get into the show. The next few stories have to do with Teamsters Local 107 out of Philadelphia, which over many decades has been linked in various ways to the Philadelphia mob, even going so far as being linked in the early 2000s. According to its own website, Local 107 described itself as follows in a 2013 posting on its history. Quote, "This local has a long storied past. Most anti-union employers will dwell on violence that has occurred back in the early days. What they fail to admit is that all unions struggled in the beginning, and the effort to defend the union's very existence was challenged by thugs that were, in large part, protected by certain segments of the various police forces. We have witnessed a change, and now, especially in Philadelphia, we have a partnership with the law and, in fact, have a labor squad that makes sure the playing field is level. Local 107 has a reputation as a hard-nosed, tough local union when it comes to dealing with employers. This toughness comes from defending our members' rights and negotiating some of the best contracts in any industry. We are a diversified union that represents all aspects of labor. Being tough does not mean being violent. We use our knowledge and experience to gain leverage in dealing with your employer." End quote. Now, if you ask me, that's on their company or their local history section. So it really sounds like a defense of the past of the local, which you're about to see was incredibly violent and not much in the way of actual, tangible, like specific history. Referring to the violence of their past, there were several grisly incidents revolving around control of Local 107, and we'll share a few of those stories in this episode. The first incident we'll discuss occurred on June 17th, 1966, when an officer of Local 107 named John Gorey and his friend, a woman named Rita Yanda, were murdered in Local 107's Philadelphia office building, the headquarters. As we dig in, you'll see that there are indeed ties to the Philadelphia mob. A report in the Philadelphia Inquirer on Sunday, June 19th, 1966, 2 days after the double homicide, detailed the incident. Quote, "Teamster official divorcee shot to death in union office. A Teamsters union official and a woman were found shot to death Saturday inside the locked headquarters of the union's Local 107 at Front and Spring Garden Streets. Each of the victims was shot in the head and at least once in the body. At least 4 bullets crashed into a wall of the tiny office on the second floor of the building's southeast corner. Police said the dead man, John Gorey, 45, a $260 a week business agent for the Local, was the father of 3 children and was separated from his wife. A son, John Jr., 28, was drowned accidentally while bathing in a pool at Atlantic City in July 1965. The woman victim, Mrs. Rita Yanda, 35, of East Lehigh Avenue near Mercer Street, was childless and was divorced from her husband." End quote. The article would detail that the bodies would be discovered Saturday morning by another business agent of Local 107 around 10 a.m. in the morning, with the medical examiner finding that Gorey and Yanda had been dead several hours prior to being discovered. Initially, there were no leads or motives, though those would begin to reveal themselves during the course of the investigation. In the immediate days after the murders, 3 top business officials of Local 107 would be hauled in for questioning for over 2 hours, several of whom, one of whom I think you'll know, and the other is important to both stories, along with 45 others. 45 other people would be questioned in the immediacy after the murder. These were Edward Battisford, who was the Local 107 president. He plays prominently in both incidents we're going to talk about. Michael Hessian, Local 107 secretary treasurer, and Frank the Irishman Sheeran, a Local 107 business agent. So obviously everybody's heard of him. But even still, no immediate leads presented themselves. However, by June 22nd, 1966, authorities had their eyes on 3 primary suspects, and they believed that 2 of the killers had surprised Gorey in his second-floor office, bursting into his cubicle and firing away, killing Gorey instantly. The killers then went behind the desk under which Yanda had fled in terror and fired 6 shots, killing her as well. Brutal. Just pretty fucking brutal. Now, the issue for the killers was that there were witnesses who'd heard the shots and observed 2 men actually fleeing from the building, despite the fact that Local 107 is typically deserted from Friday after work hours until the following Monday morning. As things began to develop more quickly in the investigation, news would break on June 23rd, 1966, that would reveal threats to Gorey's life that were made prior to the double homicide. Quote, "Slain 107 aide survived prior ride. Maybe John Gorey would be alive today if he had told police about a blood-curdling incident 3 weeks ago that bore the stamp of gangster tactics in the 1920s. He was forced into an auto, taken for a ride in which threats on his life were made, and finally was dumped rudely into the Delaware River near Morrisville, Bucks County. The Daily News learned this from an authoritative source to whom Gorey related it. But Gorey, for reasons that will never be known, didn't spill a word to police about the watery grave he managed to avoid." End quote. The question is, well, why were the threats being made? The Philadelphia Daily News was hot on the trail and about 6 days later revealed the motive for the slaying as they believed it. As it turns out, Gorey appears to have been killed 2 days before a general membership meeting in which he was about to have revealed before 12,000 members that outside auditors had confirmed a $100,000 shortage in 107's health and welfare fund, which for that time was a significant amount of money. It's a significant amount today, but at that time, even much more significant. Additionally, the previous month's meeting of Local 107's general membership had actually been broken up by a fight just before the topic of the $100,000 shortage was about to be discussed, meaning the rank and file membership didn't actually get to hear about it and remained unaware of the issue. Several reports would indicate significant factionalism within the union, which had been an ongoing issue for many years. The Philadelphia News would speculate that the fight was actually a smokescreen to ensure that the topic wasn't discussed with its members. In any event, it's clear that somebody, likely the Philly mob as you'll see, didn't want that information to come out. The union's health and welfare fund was like somebody's personal piggy bank. The authorities would center on several suspects as quickly as June 24th, just a week after the murder. These suspects were John Sullivan, Gregory Dodo Carchidi, John Rispo, who is going to factor also in the second incident that we'll discuss, and a man named Anthony Di Pasquale. So, who are these people? Let's start with John Sullivan. Sullivan, 33 years of age at the time of the murder, was an official of Local 107 who witnessed his claim was present at the office on the night of the shooting. John Rispo, an employee of Local 107 who years later would become well known as a drug distributor associated with mobster Stevie Boris, also had a brother, Robert Rispo, who was well known as a mob hitman who would become an informant, and he would be eventually in a pretty high up position, as we'll see kind of in the next case. So he's a connected guy as well, very high up in the union. Gregory Dodo Carchidi, 36 at the time of the murder, was another member of the union who was also employed as a janitor. And last but not least, Anthony DePasquale, who would eventually come to be known as Mad Dog Pasquale. Over his life, DePasquale, just 27 at the time of these murders, would develop a very violent reputation as one of Philadelphia's mob enforcers who was known to beat victims with bars, bottles, pipes, and was suspected in several underworld murders prior to his death from a car crash in July of 2000. So he would go on for many more years and be involved in many more violent incidents. Authorities would very quickly rule out that the double homicide was related to any sort of love plot or love triangle relating to Gorey, Yanda, and the suspects. Now, additionally, police would suggest that multiple guns had been used in the homicides based on the ballistics as well as the positions of the bodies. This would tend to indicate either one shooter with multiple guns or multiple shooters. Now, despite honing in on the main suspects rather quickly, about a week after the murder, it would take nearly 6 months for the men to be actually charged with the murders. When the case ultimately went to trial in 1967, here is what the key witness, a fellow janitor at Local 107 named Francis McGrath, testified went down that fateful night according to court records. As a note in the records, which are related to the trial of John Sullivan, references to him appear as appellate. So when I say appellate, actually, I've replaced appellate with the name Sullivan. So just know that if you're looking at any of the documentation, I did that for the sake of clarity of identification. Quote, the chief prosecution witness, one Francis McGrath, was employed as a janitor at the Union Hall where the bodies were eventually discovered. On June 17, 1966, he arrived at work approximately 6 p.m. and parked his automobile in the lot adjacent to the building. At that time, he specifically observed 2 other vehicles on the premises. One was owned by John Sullivan, and the other was being used at the time by one Anthony DePasquale. After alighting from his car, McGrath noticed Sullivan looking out onto the parking lot from the window of the second-floor office normally used by other union officials. The witness then entered the building and proceeded to the second floor to commence his duties. Sullivan was still seated by the window when McGrath entered that office. Sullivan inquired about the janitor's presence and instructed McGrath to wait until Sunday night to clean, since a union meeting was scheduled for that date and the building would require cleaning after the gathering. McGrath ignored the suggestion and continued collecting the trash from the offices. The witness then took the refuse outside the building. When he returned, Sullivan was still seated at the window. At this time, both Sullivan and McGrath observed John Gorey and Rita Yanda arrive at the Union Hall in Gorey's car and enter the building. McGrath then began cleaning the conference room located approximately 75 feet from Gorey's office. Shortly thereafter, Gorey appeared and had a brief conversation with McGrath. Immediately after Gorey left the conference room, Sullivan appeared in the doorway through which Gorey had just passed and again questioned McGrath about the cleaning and suggested he defer his activities until Sunday afternoon. During this brief conversation, Gregory Carchidi, another janitor, entered the conference room. No conversation ensued between Carchidi and Sullivan, but Carchidi repeated Sullivan's urgings to leave the work until Sunday. Sullivan then left the room through the same door which Gorey had exited, but Carchidi remained and seated himself behind the desk. Within several minutes, the witness testified he heard sounds like firecrackers going off in rapid succession. McGrath started to question Carchidi about the disturbance, but was abruptly instructed to get out of the building and don't say nothing. McGrath left the Union Hall and noticed 4 cars other than his own parked in the lot. These were recognized as belonging to DePasquale, Gorey, Carchidi, and Sullivan. McGrath drove off but returned to the premises within 15 minutes. Only Gorey's car remained in the lot. Upon re-entering the building, he found the offices closed, the conference room locked, and the lights out. The victims' bodies were discovered the following morning. Gorey had been shot 4 times and Yanda 6 times, the shots being fired from close range. The ballistics studies established 2 separate guns were employed in the homicides, but the weapons were never recovered. Additional testimony disclosed that the telephone lines had been arranged so that regular incoming calls would ring in the room in which Sullivan was seated. A second line with a different call number had been prearranged by Gorey to ring in his office so that he could receive an anticipated call from Joseph Vernick at 7 p.m. One Irene Glenn testified for the Commonwealth that she dialed the regular Union phone about 6:15 p.m. that evening, and a man answered, identifying himself as Gorey. A scrap paper found in the wastebasket alongside the desk where Sullivan had been seated prior to the victim's arrival contained Mrs. Glenn's name and telephone number. It was uncontested that the handwriting was that of Sullivan. Moreover, one Joseph Vernick testified that he called Gorey's office at a specifically arranged time but received no answer despite his repeated attempts between 7:15 and 8:15 p.m. This evidence, coupled with the medical examiner's testimony, indicated that the time of death could have been approximately 7:15 p.m. At the close of the case in chief, no evidence was presented by the defense. End quote. Ultimately, John Sullivan would be convicted of the murder and would receive a life sentence. In his appeal, he conceded that the Commonwealth had proved all the essential elements of the murders except the identity of the perpetrator. He would contend that this alleged failure of proof was fatal to the conviction in that, as a matter of law, the evidence was insufficient to support the verdict. Jurors would admit reaching their verdict on circumstantial evidence, and the bulk of the evidence did in fact support that Sullivan was probably involved in the conspiracy, though likely not the leader or even the trigger puller. DePasquale would serve 18 months for the killing, but would ultimately be acquitted in March of 1968 after a primary witness refused to testify and the DA would present no case. He would skate free and continue to cause murder and mayhem for several decades as an associate of the Bruno Scarfo crime family. In January of 1968, Gregory Dodo Carchidi would be found not guilty of the slayings. If you remember, that was the other janitor who seemed to kind of know what might be happening and told McGrath, the primary janitor, that he should probably leave. Now, to go back in time just a little bit, a couple of years, you kind of know how things ended, but there's an interesting angle here. Earlier in 1966, when the grand jury was convened after the murders, a witness named Mrs. Mary Boyski would testify that her son Albert had been approached by DePasquale and asked to go on the killing job. Mrs. Boyski made a statement to authorities that her son Albert had refused any part of DePasquale's proposal, but told her that DePasquale had instead recruited two others to go on the hit. Boyski would state that DePasquale, whom she identified from a photograph, someone referred to as Randy's son, and someone else referred to as Mousy, had agreed to go, and that Mousy was the actual triggerman. Randy's son was alleged to have received $600, and Mousy received $800 for their services. And there were allegedly plans to knock off another Local 107 figure named Charlie Myers next, right? So there was a hit list, supposedly. Now, this theory does tend to corroborate the information police shared in their investigation that suggested multiple shooters due to the ballistics and the positions of the bodies. According to police, 38 caliber bullets were fired from separate weapons, neither of which was ever found by police, likely coming from two different 38 caliber weapons, one believed to be a Smith & Wesson, while the other believed to be a police special. For posterity, Albert Boyski repeatedly denied his mother's statements as well as denied talking to detectives. Now, this sounds to me like a man who feared for his own life and wanting to show those in the underworld that he had not ratted them out. He had just had what he thought was going to be a private conversation with somebody that he believed would keep it confidential, which was his mother, who then is the one that brought that information forward. Now, the true identity of both of these unknown suspected shooters was never found, with Sullivan being the only one ever really convicted. Everyone else pretty much got off scot-free with minimal to no punishment. And again, another murder with some pretty heavy connections, possible motives, and all the hallmarks of a gangland slaying that looks to have been committed by the Philly mob. The final hit that we're going to discuss in this episode was another episode of violence that would also take place at the offices of Local 107 in Philadelphia, just over a year after the murders of John Gorey and Rita Yanda, almost a year to the day. While even some of the initial investigations were still kind of ongoing and the trials were taking place. It's kind of crazy. As Local 107 said in its history, it was indeed a violent chapter of the Union, and elements of the Philly mob were working hard to get the membership, who, to their credit, seemed to be fighting back against it, in line in order to continue to pilfer the Union's coffers, so to speak. Now, the victim in this case was a man named Robert DeGeorge. But as you'll see, this incident could have actually been much worse, as a gun battle involving some of the most well-known figures in the history of the Philadelphia mob were involved. And you're going to quickly see that I think all the people involved, what I think will be clear is that people that came together in this incident, everybody had bad intentions. Now, some had very, I would say, mob-driven, sadistic intentions, and others had bad intentions more from a self-preservation standpoint, and in reality probably had bad intentions, but in a good way, trying to defend the Union. And this situation, especially coming on the heels of the Gorey and Yanda murder, was pretty much a powder keg. And I'm surprised that more people were not killed. The murder that I'm talking about would take place on August 17th, 1967. As I said, again, at Teamsters Local 107, right in front of the office, with first-hand accounts from witnesses being shared in the Thursday evening edition of the Philadelphia Daily News that same day. Quote, "Man slain in gun duel near Local 107, second wounded. One man was shot to death and possibly two more wounded in a wild gun battle that broke out this morning in front of the headquarters of the trouble-racked Teamsters Local 107. A 33-year-old truck driver fell mortally wounded on the south side of Spring Garden Street near front, directly across from the Teamsters office. Separate trails of blood on both sides of Spring Garden Street indicate that at least one and possibly two more men were wounded in the blazing gun battle that erupted shortly after 8 a.m. Shot dead was Robert DeGeorge, 33, of 2309 Fernan Street, father of four, a Local 107 member and a driver for Red Star Express of Auburn, Inc., 4200 Almond Street. The wounded fled after the shooting, and police immediately launched a widespread search for them. Arthur Hersey, 44, an eyewitness, said at least 12 to 15 shots were fired by men who were shooting at each other across Spring Street. Hersey, an employee of the AAA Electric and Ace Tylene Welding Service, 1314 Frankfort Avenue, and a coworker, Howard Dixon, 52, were driving east on Spring Garden Street about 8:10 when the shooting started. The gun battle occurred almost directly across the street from Teamster Local 107 headquarters, the scene of a double murder in June 1966. Hersey said there were three guys on the south side of the street shooting at some other guys who had run to the north side. I thought it was the 4th of July, only they were real bullets. Hersey said, I stopped the truck and saw a guy get hit in the back. He staggered, tried to stand, then dropped over on his back. He gave one big sigh, and that was it. One of his buddies who had a gun came running back and said, let's get him in the car. He picked up the gun, which was lying beside the victim, and started running up and down with a gun in each hand. The only thing he said was, "Those goddamn spics." Hersey and Dixon got out of their truck and walked across the street. "We shouldn't have walked into the middle of those bullets," Hersey said, "but we wanted to help the guy who was shot." Dixon said, "At first I thought it was some kid shooting off firecrackers, but we stopped the truck when we saw this guy rolling in the street. Then we saw these guys with guns, and like dopes, we were right in the middle of it. There was a gun lying next to the wounded man. I told Hersey not to touch it, to leave it just where it was for police. Hersey said, I rolled the guy over, took off his shirt, and there was a hole in his back, under his right shoulder. I knew he was dead. His buddy, the one with 2 guns, told us to put him in the car, so we did. The gunman then jumped in and sped off. DeGeorge was taken to St. Mary's Hospital, where he died shortly after arrival. Police sped to the scene within seconds of receiving the report of a shooting outside 107. The bullets were still flying when the first officers arrived. Police issued an alert to pick up 4 men, 2 light-skinned and blonde and 2 dark-skinned, dark-haired, and finding bloody T-shirts in a nearby service station. Police issued an alert to pick up 4 men, 2 light-skinned and blonde and 2 dark-skinned, dark-haired, after finding bloody T-shirts in a nearby service station. The blood-stained shirts were found in the station at 2D and Brown Streets, about 2 blocks from the scene of the shooting, after the attendant called police to report 4 men had run into the place asking if they could wash their hands. The attendants refused, and the 4 men ran off, leaving the bloodied shirts behind. The attendant said one man's hand was bleeding. Investigators found bloodstains on the sidewalk where the mortally wounded man had fallen. They were on the south side of the street, almost directly across from the 107 entrance. Nearby, about 20 feet to the west, police found 2 casings and a bullet, all small, possibly 22 or 25 caliber. This was on the south side, near the driveway of the Acme Fast Freight Company. There was blood at this point, and it trailed west about 200 feet to New Market Street. There the trail ended. Directly across the street on the northeast corner of New Market and Spring Garden, there was another trail of blood indicating a wounded man had staggered from the corner a short distance back towards Front Street. There, this trail ended. End quote. The article would go on to detail the initial investigations of the authorities, but I just have to say that given the amount of blood present at the scene, had this happened today, and they did do some, at least attempt to do some testing of the blood. The shooters in this case would have had absolutely no chance at getting away with this killing. Of course, let alone with having such a public shooting. If it had happened today, everybody would have had their phones out filming it, right? So this is something that probably only could have happened the way that it did in an era where the technology was not as good. I think the shooters would have been dead to rights with all the evidence left at the scene. And not only that, what you'll see is as we get into the incident more, is that this shootout was not so different from the shootout at the OK Corral, as the members of Local 107 battled with elements of the Philadelphia Mafia for control over the Union. And again, to reiterate kind of the theme of Volume 1 and Volume 2, while Angelo Bruno, who was the boss of Philadelphia at the time, most likely didn't order any of his subordinates to have such a public shootout. That just doesn't seem very logical. He had to have known that this union was a powder keg, and this particular shootout, I think, happened pretty organically when both sides came together with bad intentions. But so I do think that Bruno in some way had to be aware that there was the potential for this, and possibly directing some of the actions behind the scenes that led to this confrontation. Now, a possible motive for the confrontation would come out in the next day from a man named James Melton, a shop steward of Local 107, who himself was very much in fear for his life. He related that less than 12 hours before the shootout, Robert DeGeorge had spoken out against Local 107 President Edward Battisfor at a secret meeting at 107 headquarters the previous evening. Now, Battisfor, if you remember, certainly played a part in the Gorey and Yanda shootings, as he was one of the first people to be interviewed. Now, he was ultimately not charged with anything in the Gorey and Yanda situation, but as the president, right, you're immediately thought of. In addition to speaking out against Batisfor in the secret meeting of about 60 members, DeGeorge also called for the removal of two of Batisfor's chief aides, men named Francis J. Marino and John Rispo, who was also a suspect in the Gorey and Yanda slayings. James Melton would confess that he'd actually been attacked by Rispo and his life had been threatened by Marino immediately after the secret meeting in front of actually 3 policemen, no less. And the policemen would actually help him get back into the office. Now, Melton would file charges against Rispo and Marino, who would actually be held on $50,000 bail. Philadelphia Assistant DA William H. Wolfe Jr. would state that he believed DeGeorge was murdered because he spoke out publicly to demand that they, 107, throw out Batisfor, Marino, and Rispo. Wolfe would continue on, saying that during the fiery secret meeting the night before the murder, DeGeorge had called Batisfor, Marino, and Rispo racketeers and gangsters who are taking funds from the Union. Wolfe would say that Marino and Rispo were, in fact, the power behind Local 107 President Edward Batisfor. They hire enforcers and goons at the local. The motive for the murder is this war between the two factions, and there was a murder on the streets of Philadelphia because of the war between these two factions. Another man, Local 107 business agent Charles Amoroso, would say the following of DeGeorge: "He died for me. He died because he wanted a clean union like I want." And I hate to say it, this is going to sound bad, but if you look at the pictures of Rispo and Marino that were shared in the paper, they are really straight out of Central casting. Both were alleged associates of the Bruno family, and by this point, Marino specifically was already a well-known and convicted extortionist and blackmailer. In fact, Francis Marino, who was known as Big Bobby due to his 300-pound frame, would actually later himself, this is much later, be found murdered in 1976, allegedly on orders from Russell Buffalino, after which he was bludgeoned and shot 5 times. And I guess it's a case of, well, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. In any event, another witness to the DeGeorge shooting would suggest that DeGeorge was shot in the back and not by any of the men on the street. So this is an interesting twist. The eyewitness who didn't want to be identified and who'd already by that point received many death threats was one of more than 100 bystanders who watched as DeGeorge and others traded shots with another group of men. And this is something, as we get into it, like, well, when there's a big shootout like this, there's chaos, confusion. This type of thing happens in military situations all the time, where friendly fire incidents sometimes have the potential to kill more people than actually enemy fire. And while everybody may have certainly been shooting at each other, it's certainly plausible that DeGeorge was maybe hit by somebody shooting from his own side. The Philadelphia Inquirer, I hate saying that word, not that it's anything wrong with it because I can't enunciate, would report the reluctant eyewitness's account. Quote, tells of threats. He said he had already received a telephone call threatening death if he identified the gun battle participants. 7 men came out of the hall at about 8:20 a.m. and walked across the street just as DeGeorge drove up in his 1962 Cadillac. One of the men carried something wrapped in a brown paper bag. There were at least a dozen men leaning on cars right outside the Union Hall. It looked like they knew what was going to happen. One of the men started an argument with DeGeorge, and there was a shot that came from some other place than the crowd on the street. It seemed like they didn't want anyone to touch DeGeorge, and when DeGeorge's buddy, Joseph Cherry, went to DeGeorge's side, they started firing. Cherry fired back, and that's when the running started. The theory was given credence when police found a .38 caliber revolver on a switchboard in Local 107 headquarters. They were testing to see if it was the murder weapon. End quote. In the days that followed, police would investigate the possibility that DeGeorge had been as I mentioned, accidentally wounded by Cherry during the chaos, which would make sense given that DeGeorge was noted as firing at his assailants but wounded from the back, although some reports also had him running away and then getting hit in the back. But friendly fire, as I said, can often happen in these types of firefights, so it is very plausible. Another report would suggest that perhaps DeGeorge was slain by an imported sniper, which is not out of the question, but that I find that hard to believe given all the chaos and the lack of time to have imported such a sharpshooter, given, when you hear of these types of premeditated mob hits, there's typically a need for an extensive amount of time in planning before the assassination takes place, where you have to understand people's routine and get that down, where they go, who they see, time, place, those types of things in order to get it set up. And it sounds like this in particular happened very organically. And not only that, there were many people involved in the shooting. It would sound, in my opinion, pretty dangerous, especially if you're trying to protect other people on your side, to have had a sniper firing in the middle of all of those people. Now, this one it just doesn't add up to me, especially given that DeGeorge was killed either by a 22 or a 25 caliber bullet, which doesn't sound, again, I'm not an expert on guns, so those gun experts, please correct me, but I would not believe that a 22 or a 25, which from my understanding are usually associated with smaller guns, would not be the type of bullet used in a sniper rifle. But again, leave a comment, tell me if I'm wrong there. But by this point, the local media was running wild with their speculation and really chasing down all angles. As more reports would come out, it would turn out that DeGeorge's reason for coming back to the local 107, again, this, in my opinion, reinforces the fact that there probably wasn't a sniper, because all of this happened so quickly and happened in organic fashion. His reason for coming back to the local 107 office the day after his fiery speech, literally hours after, was to get revenge on Francis Marino and John Rispo, who, as I stated, had assaulted and threatened his good friend, shop steward James Melton. And then, of course, this is the impetus for the confrontation. So there are a lot of moving pieces and parts going on here. Reports would also speculate that a 25-man goon squad hired at a rate of $50 per goon were at Local 107 to break up a scheduled meeting and win the power struggle using guns and hatchets, which is one of the events, or the event, that touched off the shooting of DeGeorge. Now, I don't know, again, based on a lot of the facts of the event, there were a lot of people there, but I don't know if it was a 25-man goon squad. In any event, hundreds would attend the DeGeorge wake a few days after he was murdered. Now, besides Marino and Rispo, there are some other pretty infamous names that would eventually be uncovered as part of this investigation. The day after the murder, papers would report that a man suffering from a bullet wound in the stomach was admitted at Methodist Hospital some 3 hours after the shooting. That man's name would come to be known as none other than Joseph Chicky Ciancaglini, 33 years old at the time, who is a man that would later become an infamous, very infamous, almost legendary capo regime in the Bruno Scarfo family, and who only actually died very recently. Now, he was listed as a common iron worker and was noted as refusing to tell police how and when he was shot. Now, other reports would actually show that most likely he was shot by DeGeorge out of self-defense. As a result, police would actually, this is the part where I was saying the testing probably would have caught these guys red-handed. Police would actually test blood samples from Ciancaglini as well as the bullet to determine if they could match it to the crime scene. Additionally, police would identify Batisfor as the man who masterminded the murder after it was determined that he'd signaled the 7-man group of goons to DeGeorge that fateful morning. So Batisfor, of course, was Local 107's president. For his part, Batisfor would claim that he'd only asked for administrative help from the office of Teamsters Vice President Frank Fitzsimmons, who was in charge of the Teamsters while Jimmy Hoffa was in jail. Batisfor would say that I inherited a jungle when referring to Local 107. And in another twist, investigators would center not just on Ciancaglini, but also on a business agent of Local 107 that, again, you might know because he did come up in the Gorey and Yanda investigation. None other than Frank the Irishman Sheeran, 46 years old at the time of the incident. And again, we know that Sheeran's, a lot of his tale is fabricated and legend by this point. But these are definitely two instances where we have actual proof or reporting that is true, that is confirmable, that he was here and involved in this. By that point, Sheeran had accumulated a record of 8 previous arrests, with his first pinch coming in February of 1947. Sheeran had gone on the lam after the shooting and had been missing since the day of the shooting, though his lawyer would eventually submit to questioning of his client on August 29th, 1967, a few weeks after the murder. Now, before any arrests had actually taken place, sources would indicate that on the day before the shootout, one member of Local 107 was alleged to have warned DeGeorge that he had 24 hours to live. And a witness who'd talked to police had stated that DeGeorge himself had said, "I'm fingered. I've been told I've got 24 hours to live." Additional reports suggest that several men brought guns into Local 107 the night before, and that it was clear that top officials of 107 had made plans to whack DeGeorge. In any event, on September 1st, 1967, 5 men would be charged with the murder of Robert DeGeorge. These were Francis Frank the Irishman Sheeran, 46, a key member of Local 107's executive board, who, as I stated, had an arrest record dating back to 1947, but no actual time in prison. We know that Sheeran was, of course, immortalized in The Irishman. Rocco Turra, 29, an unemployed construction worker, but in actuality was one of the leaders of the infamous 10th and Oregon crew, a group that has historically been very close with the Bruno crime family. Joseph Chicky Ciancaglini, 33, who was also listed at the time as an unemployed iron worker with 3 arrests to his name by that point. Now, as I said, we know that Chicky would go on to become somewhat of a legend within the Philadelphia mob. Patrick Black Pat Abruzzi, 29, also an unemployed construction worker and also a reputed leader of a 10th and Carpenter based group based upon the research that I was able to find. And John West, 48, a truck driver from Food Fair Stores with an arrest record at the time dating back to 1933 when he was just 13 years old. So all in all, I think it's fair to say that we're dealing with some heavy hitters in this particular case. On the day of the arrest, Local 107 was tied directly to the Bruno crime family. A report out of the Philadelphia Daily News read as follows, quote, "Local 107 captive of Cosa Nostra. In a startling new development in the probe of the murder of Teamster Robert A. DeGeorge, investigators have uncovered evidence that Teamsters Local 107 has become a virtual captive of the infamous Cosa Nostra. A source told the Daily News that the crime syndicate may have ordered the gunning down of DeGeorge to show dissident factions of Local 107 that it meant business in its backing of the regime now in power. There is, said one source, a connection between the Cosa Nostra and the individuals behind DeGeorge's murder." End quote. The article would go on to say the following about the link. Pretty long article. Quote, The evidence linking the Cosa Nostra to the DeGeorge killing was gathered by members of the DA's staff and police department detectives who have been grilling numerous 107 members and other witnesses of the gunfight. We have discovered that the Cosa Nostra runs 107, the source said. We're coming up with specifics now that show the Cosa Nostra has been milking funds from the local by backing hijacking, extortion, loan sharking, and gambling. Two, said the source, a well-known figure of the Philadelphia branch of the Cosa Nostra has been working out of 107 as a liaison man for the syndicate. He's always around, the source said. The source also said that the Cosa Nostra's power is centered around several so-called union organizers who have been selling out members of 107 by blackmailing owners and operators of numerous firms. These organizers reportedly have been visiting businessmen whose employees are not affiliated with any union and threatening to strike their business if the businessmen failed to recognize the Teamsters and cooperate in having their workers join the union. After getting the businessmen on their knees, the source said, these organizers suddenly turn up as nice guys and suggest that the whole deal could be forgotten for a nice fat fee. End quote. Now, I think it's safe to say that unions are the mafia's bread and butter. However, hindsight is 2020, and I would say at that point, the public at large was not aware the extent of the mafia's infiltration of unions and just how deep their level of control and power really ran. I think they were starting to understand it with the Hoffa and the Kennedy investigations in the 60s, but it would take decades for that to really unravel. And not only that, this was happening across the entire country. Every mafia family in the country had their hooks into unions so deep that it was really hard at that point, especially without the legal authority to really pull them out. It was nearly impossible to get the mafia out of the unions, and mafia in the unions has continued well into the 1990s, well into the 2000s. Even recently, the Colombo family was arrested for a decades-long infiltration of unions. Now, for quite a while, several of the men charged, including Sheeran and Tura, would go on the lam and not be able to be located. Sheeran would finally give himself up in September of 1967, while Ciancaglini would actually attend his hearing in a wheelchair while he recovered from his gunshot wound. Rocco Tura would eventually be caught and seized by the FBI while hiding out in a Miami Beach motel that same month, in which he would be arraigned. All of the accused men would go on trial individually. They'd all have their trials separated a few years after the homicide. And I think what you'll see is one by one, they all managed to avoid significant jail time for the homicide. They all managed to really get out from under it. The first man to go on trial would be Chicky Ciancaglini, who after 2 weeks would be acquitted of the killing in February of 1969. In February of 1962, so it would be 3 years later, a lot of foot dragging here after several years, and by this point, this was 5 years after the actual murder had taken place. Rocco Tura would finally go on trial, and he would ultimately be acquitted of the killing as well. The following month, March of 1972, 53 months to be exact after the murder, the case against Frank Sheeran would ultimately be dropped as well. So again, one by one, they're all being let go. In April of 1972, the last person standing, Patrick Black Pat Abruzzi, would also see charges against him dropped, and he would be the last man in the case to see charges dismissed, as the fifth defendant, John West, would actually pass away before going to trial. So all in all, I think it's fair to say that justice was never served in the Robert DeGeorge case, and many of these characters, Sheeran, Ciancaglini, Tura, would all go on to commit murder and mayhem, in the facility of their function as either members or associates of the Philadelphia crime family. Okay, that's it for another episode of Philadelphia Mob Hits. I hope you enjoyed the series. I'm thinking about extending this series to other cities and covering important hits in other cities. I think it has the potential to carry over well. Certainly, there were certainly murders in plenty of other places that would warrant some increased attention. I do plan to move on from this type of episode. I did this because I'm waiting on a lot of paperwork. I want to get back to biographies. I think that is my bread and butter. I do want to sprinkle in some interviews, so I do feel like I've got a couple of those coming down the pipe. But other than that, I'm just going to keep on keeping on. I'm feeling a lot better. Thank you to those who reached out to me. Just trying to settle down and not let life get me down as much as maybe I had been before. But yeah, thank you for all your support. As mentioned, I'm working on that 10,000 subscriber mark on YouTube. So please subscribe if you haven't already. If you appreciate the research, please go check out my Patreon channel. A couple of people have been asking about it, and really to just qualify, what are the benefits of Patreon thus far? And I'm always working on evolving those. Number one, it's early access to every video. So every video that I make that ends up on YouTube will be on Patreon first, usually 3, 4, maybe 5 days ahead of time. Number two, there is some content on YouTube that gets caught up in their copyright filters, in their content filters, that I either A, can't post, or B, can't monetize, which of course is a big problem. So that content has no issue on Patreon. So that content will typically be on the Patreon channel. In fact, the volume 2, the hits volume 2, I was actually able to create a version of that video that included some of the movie clips, which I believe is covered under fair use, which is another topic altogether, but it has no issue getting through Patreon. So a lot of that content will live there and won't live on YouTube. There will be exclusivity with some of my content on Patreon. And of course, the goal would be to look for additional perks on the Patreon channel. I've already thought of some other things that I can start doing on Patreon to make it kind of worth the price of admission. You can go over there for free. A lot of my content that gets released on YouTube will be on Patreon for free. But as I said, there is going to be some exclusive Patreon only content. So let's go ahead and put a button on this episode. And as I end every episode, grazie.
Thank you for listening to the Gangland History Podcast. If you'd like to donate to the show, check out our Patreon channel. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe to help the channel grow. If you're an audio-only listener, subscribe via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Until next time, don't forget to keep your mouth shut.